Alright, welcome to my pipeline for making PBR materials in Blender and Photoshop. Now the PBR material we're making today is going to have an albedo texture, a normal map, and a metallic map. And in order to make those, we need to bake down 4 different maps in Blender. And that includes an ambient occlusion map, a convex map, a normal map, and an ID map. Now, I'm not going to go in detail on 3D modeling in Blender. There's plenty of great tutorials online going in depth on that whole process. Today, we're just focusing on making materials. I'm simply making a basic 3D model referencing real life photos. And once I make the low poly model, I duplicate it, put it on a layer underneath, and I make a high poly sculpt of it to get all that detail. And that's important for the next step in the process of making texture maps. Now that we're done with our model, we should have something that looks like this. The UV's all unwrapped. This is the low poly model, and then underneath it is the high poly sculpt, which has all the detail that we're going to use to bake down. Now to start off, before we can bake the maps, we need to make sure that this object has a texture on it. So first let's go over here and make a new texture. This is fine. We'll just have a 1024 by 1024 texture. Hit OK. So now we have this texture here, and let's assign it in the material. It was this one. So now this object actually has a texture that we can bake onto. And we want to make sure that we have the layer underneath shift selected. And we'll first select the high poly mesh, and then we shift select the low poly mesh. And let's go to the render tab, scroll all the way down to the bottom, make sure you're in cycles render. And down here at the bottom, let's go here and select ambient occlusion. We'll start by baking the ambient occlusion map. Check the box that's selected to active because we're baking information from one object to the other. And the standard stuff for this is perfectly fine. You may need to adjust it, but we'll make a test and see how that looks. Okay, so this is pretty good. As you can see, it's baked in all of the shadows in the creases of the object. So just go ahead and save as the image to wherever you need it, and we'll use it once we're finished with the rest. Let's move on to the convex map. Now the convex map is a little bit more complicated because we're trying to define the outer corners of stuff, and there's no specific way to do it in Blender, but there's a little trick you can do to define it. So let's go over here, change this window to the node editor, and let's go over to the 3D view here, go down to the high poly, select it. Now I've already made this custom material, which isn't that complicated, but you can grab this, get a geometry, color ramp, a mixed, diffuse, going to the output. Make sure the color ramp is connected like that. Everything should be set up like this. Now, if we go ahead and look at it as rendered, you can see this looks really wonky, and that's not exactly what we're wanting. And it's simply because the pointiness is trying to find sharp edges, but there's not an even amount of geometry across the entire model. If you see here, if we go into the geometry, it's very dense in some areas, and then it's very sparse in other areas, and it needs to be even with the polygons across the entire model. And we can change that by simply going to the modifier panel, and let's add in the remesh modifier. Once we have that, it looks pretty funny, but let's make sure that in the remesh, it's set to smooth, and then we just bring up the poly count of it right here. The higher you go, the harder it is to render it, so be careful how high you go with it. And let's just bump it all up as high as we can. Make sure to uncheck remove disconnected pieces. Smooth shading, and that looks pretty good. Let's bring it up maybe one more, which is going to be intense on the computer, but it's really going to define those details. So now you can't see it in here because it's just a modifier, but basically what this modifier has done has redistributed the polygons throughout the entire model so that there are an even distribution throughout. And by doing that, this pointiness geometry is going to be able to define sharp edges a lot easier. So now we go to render mode. There you have it. As you can see, it's literally grabbing all of the outer edges and it's sharpening them. Now you can go in here and tweak the color ramp and pull it in and out and show however much you want. But basically what we're trying to do here is define kind of where scratches would be on an object. So anything that's sticking out, obviously that's the first place that something would hit it and it would get scuffed or scratched. So I'd say this is pretty good right here. So if we go ahead and let's go back to solid. So that's set up. Now, if we basically do the same thing with this as we did with the ambient occlusion, let's shift select the upper layer. We already have the high poly mesh selected. So let's shift select the low poly and let's go change this back to the UV editor. Now, since we've already saved this, we don't need to worry about it anymore. We'll just bake on top of it. Go to the render settings, scroll to the bottom to bake, and instead of ambient occlusion, we want to change this to diffuse. And these will both be selected, but unselect those because all we want to bake is the color of the high poly mesh. Make sure you have selected to active, checked, and that should be everything. So let's go ahead and test this bake. All right, that looks beautiful. Once we get this into Photoshop, we're gonna be able to really utilize this information to make some awesome looking texture. The next one we want to do is bake the normal map. And before we can do that, we want to make sure that we go down to the high poly mesh, go to the modifier panel, and we don't need this remesh modifier anymore. So we can go ahead and just delete that. And so let's go back to the render settings. Make sure that you shift select the high poly to the low poly. Everything's set up the way we like it. Let's just make sure we change the bake settings from diffuse to normal and just hit bake. Now the last map we want to bake is the ID map, and that is meant to define different aspects of your object. So say we want a different metal for the bolts here on the fire hydrant as opposed to the painted metal of the actual fire hydrant itself. And how we do that is simply go to material, go to the material tab here, and let's change this to just a flat color. And we can add in more materials by hitting this plus button here, and let's select this blue that I've already made. Now we have two colors we can choose from, and we can go here and let's just say we want to select this bolt. So if you hover over this bolt and hit L, it selects all the polygons that are attached to each other. And then if we select the blue and hit assign, as you can see, now it's made the entire bolt blue. So let's go ahead and do that to all the bolts really quick. And hit assign. There we go. So now we have all of the bolts a different color than the actual fire hydrant. And then if we want to, we can even add in another color. So let's hit the plus button and let's just hit new. Since we only have red and blue here, we want a third color. Let's hit new and let's change this color to a green. We want to make sure that each color is very different from the other ones so that it's easy to mask them out individually later on. So now that we have this third color here, let's select this part. So if you hold down Alt and click, it does a loop selection. So all of these polygons are selected, and let's hit the green and hit assign. Boom. So now we have this color down here, the red and the blue. So now we have three different masks that we can take advantage of when we go in to start texturing. And just like the convex map, let's go to the bake settings down here at the bottom in the render tab, shift select the low poly mesh, go to diffuse again, and we just want the color yet again. All the settings should be the same, and hit bake. There we go. So one thing that you want to make sure of, if I go to the low poly mesh really quick and I hit tab, As you can see, on the outer edge of these UV islands, the color is going beyond it. And that's because here in the bake settings, I have the margin set to 16 pixels, which means outside of the UVs, it's extending that color 16 pixels out. And this really helps for when you have, let's say, mint mapping in your game and the resolution of your texture downsizes. You don't want the edges of your UVs to start sampling the incorrect colors. So this is really important. Make sure that all of your textures have a little bit of a margin on the outside of all of your UVs. One thing that I forgot to mention is that, as you can see here in the texture, here's a good example. There is blue where it shouldn't be. Here on looking at the polygon and over here where it's referencing on the texture, there's blue here and it looks like it's pulling it from this bolt. And we don't want that. And the reason why it's doing that is because it's shooting a ray from this polygon and it's reaching out to anything, and it's reaching out too far and it's touching this bolt here. So if you go down here to the bake settings, see where it says ray distance, it says 1. Now that's definitely too far. So let's drop this down to 0.2, and that ray distance will hopefully not reach out so far to touch the bolt, but it'll reach out and touch all of the detail information from the high poly sculpt that is within this area. So let's try that really quick. Shift select the high poly to the low poly and hit bake. There we go. So now, as you can see, we no longer have that incorrect color here because it wasn't able to reach all the way out to where this bolt is, and that fixes it. As you can see, also it kind of did a little bit too far here, so you might want to do another bake and decrease the ray distance a little bit more. But for the most part, you should be doing this with all of your textures so that you don't have strange artifacts later on when you're trying to texture it. Here in Photoshop, I've brought in the ambient occlusion map, the convex map, the normal map, and the ID map. And I've also created 3 new Photoshop files called albedo, metallic, and normal. These are the 3 textures that we're actually going to be using on the PBR material. So let's start out with the albedo texture, and let's copy over the necessary maps onto this texture. So let's start out with the ambient occlusion. So right click the layer here in the ambient occlusion texture, hit duplicate layer, and we want to duplicate it to the albedo. So hit OK. As you can see here in the albedo texture, it's pasted it in as a new layer. Let's do the same thing with the convex and the ID. Now we have all 3 of these here in the albedo. Let's hide them really quick and let's just show the ambient occlusion. Now with the ambient occlusion, it's as easy as going to multiply. Nothing changed obviously because the layer underneath is white as well. But if I change this color, let's say to this yellow, as you can see, the ambient occlusion now is just a darkening overlay. It doesn't need to do anything else. And we can go in here, and if we want to simply just duplicate it, darken those creases a little bit, or we can go to image adjustments, levels, we can really tweak the brightness and contrast of the ambient occlusion. But for now, we'll just leave it as is. So let's hide that. And for the convex, we want to add a layer underneath it, and let's make our active color black, and this is just an empty layer. Let's hit Alt D, which fills the entire layer underneath the convex. And let's shift select both of these and merge layers. So now we have this entire thing, and we're going to use it as a mask later on. Let's just hide that. Now with the ID, before we can do anything with that, let's change the background layer just to white to make sure that nothing is interfering with it. So let's select the ID again, and we want to make each of these colors individual layers. So how we do that is go to select color range, and we want to pick one of the colors. So let's do blue first, blue, and let's turn the fuzziness, say 70 is probably good, and hit OK. So now it's selected anything in the image that's blue. Let's make a new layer over top, and let's make just fully black color. Hit OK. Alt delete. That fills that new layer you've made with black, and Command D for deselect. Now it's made a layer out of all the blue areas. And let's do that same thing, make a new layer, have that ready, and hide both of these. Actually, let's just put both of these underneath. Now we've got the ID again. Let's select the next color, red. Go to select color range, click on the red and hit OK. Now all the red's selected. Hide it really quick. And with this new layer we've created, there's nothing on it yet, and make sure that the color is black. Okay, hit Alt Delete. Now we have, this is everything that's red. So let's hide that again, make a new layer, select this again, and let's get the green. So select color range, click on the green, hit OK. Let's hide that, select the new layer, Alt Delete, and deselect. So now we have each of these layers defining the different areas of the texture. Okay, so we can hide that and we have each of these. So now we have all of the information we need to start making the texture. Okay, so let's start out with making the base color. So let's just fill it with, let's say, a red, just a basic red color, somewhere around there, and just fill your layer underneath. Now let's reveal the albedo. Now it's showing the shadows where it needs to be. And the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and show the convex areas we want to reveal. And let's make a new layer right up above the ambient occlusion. And let's fill that with, this is going to be like a metal color. So let's just do a basic gray first. So hide that. And let's fill that. So let's just say this is just the metal that's going to be revealed underneath the paint. And how we just define where we want the scratches to be, grab this layer, hit Command A, that selects the entire canvas, Command C to copy, and then we hide this layer. Let's go here, hit this right down here. This is going to make a mask. If you hold down Alt and click on the mask, that makes it active. And since we've copied the convex layer, we can hit Command V, which pastes it in, and click out of it back here. Now you can see it's only revealing that gray color where this map is white. So white on a mask means you can totally see through it. Black means it's totally invisible, and any color in between is a gradient of that. So we can really tweak it a lot if we go, let's say it's levels, and we want to kind of make it a little bit sharper looking, a little bit harder in some areas, hit OK, boom. So it's a lot sharper edges, and it's actually very simple and easy. If we want to make it look more like scratches and everything, just get a custom brush, just select something that's a little dirty, and then you can just start painting in here. But for now, we'll just keep it as simple as that. Okay, so let's just hide that. And now we want to have the different IDs that we created defining those areas. This is the blue, which is defining the bolts. So we want to have this a metal color as well. So let's pick kind of, let's say it's something like that color. Set your layer to lock with only the pixels that are active in the layer and hit Alt Delete. That fills everything with that color. I don't really like that color. Let's do something more like, sure. Okay, so now all the bolts are being defined by that color. And this is defining the red underneath, which we don't necessarily need because the red is being filled by the background layer. So let's just hide that. And then this is the green, which is kind of the bottom part of the fire hydrant. And that should probably be some kind of a rusty color. So let's get that, set the layer to lock and hit Alt D. That filled it. Now let's make it a little bit darker. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need for your albedo. This is all the information. You can have fun with it, add in some overlay textures to give it some variation and so on. Let's move on to the normal map. Okay, so here in the normal map, all we need to do is actually take the normal, duplicate the layer over to normal, hit OK. Now we have it as a separate layer. Pretty much this is all you're going to need for the normal map, unless you want to have extra detail. Okay, so let's move on to the metallic map. The metallic map can use the same textures as the albedo. So let's get the ambient occlusion, duplicate over to metallic, convex, duplicate, and the ID. Okay, so now we have all of these layers here, and let's pretty much do the same thing that we did with the albedo. Okay, once you've done some tweaking with the layers in the metallic map, just shift select everything, drag it down to this, which duplicates it, right click it, merge layers, hit Command A, which selects the whole canvas, Command C copies it. Let's go to channels and hit new layer down here. That makes an alpha channel here in the channels, and hit Command V. that pastes your selection. And then if we go back to the layers, we can delete this and we have that information there. So let's hide that, make the background color something a little bit darker. Okay, so how metallic maps work is here in the layers, it defines the reflectivity of your map. All of the detailed reflective information is defined here in the alpha channel. So this is where you're going to want to have fun painting in all of the little extra dings and scratches and stuff like that. But out here, this is just defining the different properties. So all of the bolts are more of a metal color, so they're a lighter color. The red paint color on the fire hydrant is a little bit less reflective, so it's going to be a darker color. And so that's all the information you're going to need. So I'm going to use Unity to test out my material on my object. So just import all the files you need here into a folder, and let's first drag out the object. So here we have the fire hydrant just as we build it inside of Blender, and let's assign a material to it. Just make a new material and drag and drop it on top. As you can't see anything yet, but if we look here at the material, make sure it's a standard shader. First, let's assign the albedo. So we have the albedo that we made in Photoshop right here. So just drag and drop it on top. So I've taken the liberty of adding in more detail. You can see all of the scratches and things that I added, which really helps out a lot. And let's go ahead and add in the metallic. So drag that one right on top here. And normally I like to have my metallic maps set to either 0.6 or 0.7 smoothness, because sometimes they get a little bit too sharp. I could be doing something wrong, but to me it seems 0.6 or 0.7 works best. And the last one obviously is the normal map. So just click and drag that in the normal map slot, and there you have it. Looks pretty good. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And this is basically the pipeline that I've made while working on our game, The Pedestrian. And we've been working on this game for a while. And if you're interested in it, check the links in the description to check it out. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.